As in a voyage, when the ship is at anchor, if you go on shore to get water, you may amuse yourself with picking up a shellfish or a truffle in your way. But your thoughts ought to be bent towards the ship, and perpetually attentive, lest the captain should call, and then you must leave all these things, that you may not have to be carried on board the vessel, bound like a sheep. Thus, likewise in life, if, instead of a truffle or shellfish, such a thing as a wife or a child be granted to you, there is no objection. But if the captain calls, run to the ship, leave all these things, and never look behind. But if you are old, never go far from the ship, lest you should be missing when called for. So today we're looking at the 7th chapter of the Enchiridion by Stoic philosopher Epictetus. And we have sort of a complicated metaphor at the beginning. And I'm going to start by going through that and talking about what I think is going on with this. So we get this image of a sailor. You're on the ship pulls into ship is at anchor. You're able to go to shore to get some water, and you can amuse yourself by picking things up. It's okay to pick up some shells, pick up some truffles, pick up some things that you find interesting. But you got to be ready to let go of those things, right? When the captain calls, you need to be ready to just drop them where you found them and walk back onto the ship. And not only that, but you need to be perpetually attentive, because if you don't let go, if you don't forget to let go, and you're still holding on to these things when it's time to go, when the captain calls, you're going to be forced onto the ship. You're going to be bound and dragged onto the ship, right? And then Epictetus says, thus likewise in life. So in life, what he's saying is, we're not talking about walking around picking up like a truffle or a shellfish. We're talking about important relationships. So your relationship, he talks about like a wife or a child. And I think, to be fair, we should also be talking about husbands as well, and friends, and all the important social relationships that we value. And thing is, he's saying that it's not wrong to do that. Like, he's not saying, he doesn't have an objection to forming these meaningful relationships. And it's like thank God. Like, if he was saying that we should never form these relationships, I don't think he'd get many followers. But he's saying, no, yeah, you can have these relationships, but just like in the ship, you have to be ready to let go when the captain calls. And so when I think about, the captain calling, what I think about is sort of like an angel of death kind of figure. I think about the personification of the knowledge that your death is imminent. So I think about the call of the captain being this kind of signal that we get that says your death is imminent. And then when you're back on the ship, walking onto the ship is dying, and then being on the ship is being dead. So what Epictetus is telling us is that, he's telling us that it's okay to form these relationships, but eventually you're going to be at a point where you're about to die. Death is imminent, and you need to be ready to let go of those relationships so that you can walk voluntarily onto the ship, right? Now, one thing that we don't always think about when reading chapter 7 of the Enchiridion is the perspective, not just of the sailor, but of the child or the wife, right? And I think what we have to ask is, like, what's their experience of this like? It's all well and good for me to be dying and I let go of everybody, but we can also examine what happens when they don't let go of you, right? And to kind of give us a picture of what that could look like, I think a great description of that is in "Do Not Go Gentle Into That Good Night" by Dylan Thomas. I'm going to read to you just the final like 4 lines, or I guess 8 lines. And you, my father, there on the sad height, curse, bless me now with your fierce tears, I pray. Do not go gentle into that good night. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. Right? So what's being demanded here, what's being asked of the Father, is that he doesn't go gently and willingly and without a fight into death. Right? So this is the equivalent of saying, I don't want you to just walk onto the ship. If we're going back to the metaphor from Epictetus, I don't want you to walk onto the ship. I want you to fight with every last breath against it. Really what he's advocating is that that his Father be carried onto the ship, bound, right? Bound. That's exactly the thing that Epictetus is warning about. And so the antidote being prescribed here, is to let go. And not just to not just, it's easier said than done to let go, but to kind of live your life in a way where you're constantly aware that you will have to let go, right? So you make sure that you enjoy those relationships while you have them, knowing that you're going to have to let go eventually. And that when the time comes, when the captain calls, when you see that you're about to enter into that good night, you're ready to do that peacefully. And what we do in logic-based therapy is we have names for the various kinds of fallacies that people engage in. These kinds of reasoning that people engage in and that cause them to disturb themselves. One of those is awfulizing, where you think that something is completely and totally and purely awful. If something is bad about, it is just purely and horribly awful. Not a little awful, not awful with qualification, but awful without qualification. And we think of death as being like that. And so this is one antidote to awfulizing, because instead of just going on as you were before and thinking death is awful, and the reason why it's awful is because I have all these really strong connections and I'm going to have to lose these connections. An antidote being suggested by Epictetus is that you live your life in a way where you're constantly aware of the reality of giving, of letting go, and you work on coming to terms with that early, right? And you work on holding on to this idea that the things and the people and the relationships that you encounter are temporary. It's totally fine to enjoy them. There's no objection to that. But you need to be ready to let go of them, right? So that's an antidote to the awfulizing about death. But there's another thing we do that makes us miserable, and it's called dutiful worrying. So dutiful worrying is when we think to ourselves, I must continue to disturb myself and ruminate over this situation until it is solved. Right? So in the case of dutiful worrying about death, what you would think is, I must continue to disturb myself and worry about this until the situation is solved. And there is no solution that's going to keep you alive. Like, you're not going to come out of life alive. That's just a given. But what you can do is choose not to worry about it. There's no moral obligation to worry about death. And there's also no moral obligation to force other people to worry about death. Right? One extension of dutiful worrying is like demanding that other people engage in the dutiful worrying as well, and that involves a certain amount of self-centeredness. It involves a certain amount of world revolves around me thinking, right? And so in the poem, "Do Not Go Gentle Into That Good Night," there's a kind of like world revolves around me thinking, in the sense that the son has built for himself an obligation to worry, to engage in dutiful worrying. And then he's projecting that onto his father, where now what he wants is the father to have the same attitude towards death as him. Okay? And so, again, the antidote contained in this 7th chapter is letting go, and to live your life in such a way that you're always aware of the fact that you're going to have to let go eventually.